Hello and welcome to today's webinar on Heraldry in America. My name is Ginevra Morse, Director of Education and Online Programs here at the New England Historic Genealogical Society. I will be moderating today's event. NEHGS is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history and are pleased to offer this webinar today for our members and friends around the world. Today's presenter is Dr. Nathaniel Taylor, editor and publisher of The American Genealogist, a specialist in medieval Europe. He taught medieval and modern history at Harvard and elsewhere for 15 years, including the social, political, and military origins of heraldry at the time of the Crusades. His genealogical research spans from medieval Spain, France, and Britain to colonial New England and Virginia. He has been on the NEHGS Committee on Heraldry since 2006 and is now its vice chairman. And he was elected a Fellow of the American Society of Genealogists in 2011. So in the next 45 minutes or so, Dr. Taylor will provide a basic foundation for understanding the history and terminology of heraldry, how it is regulated in the UK and America, and how it can enrich your family history research. At any time during the presentation, please feel free to write a question in the panel to the right of your screen, and Nat will answer as many as he can in the last 10 to 15 minutes of the hour. And we will select questions that are more general in nature, so please consider that when submitting your query. There is no handout for this lecture, but you can find a subject guide and resource list for this topic on AmericanAncestors.org. This event is also being recorded, so you can easily go back and review the video. So really don't worry if you miss something on today's first listen. You can always go back and rewatch, pause, fast forward, or rewind the presentation. All right, now without further ado, I will turn things over to Nat.
Thank you, Ginevra. I'm glad to be here. This is my first webinar, so hopefully there will be no technical kinks. And I'm very gratified that so many are interested in an introduction to heraldry for genealogists. I'm happy to share my interest with you. My interest and my knowledge of heraldry goes back to my days, really not so much as a genealogist, but as a historian, teaching about medieval society and culture, which is the time when heraldry was invented and the social and political context that gave rise to this visually amazing system of identification. As I moved into genealogy, I saw both the use and the misuse of heraldry in genealogy, and I'm happy to work with today's presentation, kind of combining those two views into laying out a couple of key concepts about what are the important approaches for genealogists interested in heraldry, or if you encounter heraldry in the wild. Next, we're starting with a few definitions of terms, including the first term, which really defines our whole topic, and then another term I'm going to just single out, crest, which 80% of people simply use wrong. We will get to that. So heraldry, our first term, really has a broad definition and a narrow one. Narrowly, it is the graphic representation of an individual or family on a coat of arms. This is the visual scheme that we associate with heraldry. And it's a symbol or series of symbols arranged on a shield or other military-derived shape, going back to heraldry's origins, like a flag or military clothing. Heraldry, in this definition, a coat of arms is something that is not just a design, but is inherited, passed on from parents to children, fathers to sons, because it has a male-centric context, according to specific customs. And the customs governing how heraldry is inherited vary in different European countries. And finally, it's a set of symbols that has recognizable graphic design elements, that there are conventions governing how they're arranged and how they're displayed. And one of the important concepts is that it is something which is unique. The coat of arms borne by an individual is supposed to be different from the coat of arms borne by any other individual. We'll come back to that uniqueness principle later. The broader definition of heraldry, though, is a much broader collection of things having to do with what heralds do. And a herald is a kind of social officer, either a private or government-appointed officer who regulates coats of arms, but also participates in courtly life, officiates at tournaments, court ceremonies, and heralds, because of the implications of inherited heraldry, heralds are also involved in genealogy. They trace families, and we'll see a little bit of that as well. Next. Now, a coat of arms is the design that is the central element of our definition of heraldry. And so this is the narrower sense. The design is usually on a shield, although that also varies. And here we have a coat of arms of George Calvert, Lord Baltimore, an early American colonial governor, or somebody after whom a colony was. It was his brother who became, his son who became the first proprietary governor of Maryland. Now, this coat of arms of George Calvert is depicted simply on just a shield. A coat of arms can also be depicted as part of a larger heraldic display, which is sometimes called an achievement. And this is on the next slide. We've got the same coat of arms of the Lords Baltimore, as a simple coat, a simple shield, but on the right, a larger full heraldic achievement, which is the complete representation of heraldic identity, which includes not only the coat of arms in the middle, but also various other elements of heraldic display. And so this is the full achievement of Cecil Calvert, second Lord Baltimore, which was printed on a map of Maryland published in 1635. Next slide. So the next slide shows the elements of, I've got listed them out on the right as vocabulary words. The elements of a full heraldic achievement include not just the coat of arms in the middle, but at the top, you see here these two spears with flags sticking out of a special crown. That's the crest. The crest is a heraldic complementary design that usually often goes with the coat of arms on the shield. It's a separate design, sometimes complementary in terms of the symbolism, usually complementary in terms of colors. We'll talk about crests again in a minute. Under the crest is this helmet. Surrounding the helmet is the mantling, the cloth that's here depicted in red, silver, and gold, which picks up the colors of the main coat of arms. And those are conventionally used just to liven up the depiction of the full heraldic achievement. Underneath the helmet, between the helmet and the shield, is the coronet, a symbol of the rank of baron that was held by the Lords Baltimore in the English peerage. To the left and right of the shield, these marvelous creatures are the supporters, that are the additions to a shield, always depicted holding it up or supporting it, which are customarily used in different European traditions to denote people of a particularly high rank. So in England, only the peers and certain others are entitled to use supporters. And so when supporters appear in heraldic achievement, they tell us something about rank. At the bottom of this image is a motto rendered out on a scroll, kind of, that's depicted in the drawing. And mottos, like crests, are often listed out as the other individual component of the heraldic achievement of a person. They help identify a person, and by extension his family. We'll come back to mottos as well in a minute. The next term is more of a concept than something you see on a coat of arms. The blazon is the textual description of the visual elements of the design of a coat of arms. And blazon is a set of vocabulary words, and it's a way of stringing them together in an expected order that efficiently describes the design in a coat of arms. The word blazon and the language of blazon derive from the Old French vocabulary used in courts throughout Europe in the later Middle Ages, including the English court, which conducted a lot of its social life and some of its business in French in the late Middle Ages. And in the language of blazon, this coat of arms of the Lords Baltimore, the upper left and lower right-hand corners are described as pale or and sable, a bend counterchanged, and the upper right and lower left quadrants are blazoned as quarterly argent and gules, across botany counterchanged. And so actually we'll get to what this means, the fact that the design is quartered this way in just a moment. So coming to the next section, moving out just from a few definitions to elements of design. Now, there are whole books devoted to principles of heraldic design in different traditions, different national European traditions. I just want to emphasize a few basics and to say that, well, this is something about which one could spend a lifetime studying. So next. There are really three basic design elements of coats of arms. There are the colors chosen for the visual elements, and then there are the geometric shapes or divisions of a shield, or the laying out of geometric shapes, which in a way that can sometimes be confused for ways in which the shield is divided. And then there are charges or visual separate designs placed on the shield, pictures of beasts or objects. And of those three design elements, almost all coats of arms can be seen to be made up and described in the language of blazon. And now coats of arms are further combined or modified by, as you saw with the Lords Baltimore, combining more than one coat of arms on the same shield, and that can be either quartering, which is combining coats of arms inherited from different ancestors, impaling, which is combining side by side the arms of husband and wife, or differencing and cadency, and we'll get to that in a moment. It's a little more complex. The next slide, colors. The tinctures, the metals, and the furs, these are the traditional colors that by the end of the Middle Ages, some were more prevalent in certain countries than others, but we have these colors arranged in groups, the 5 colors, properly said, on the top, tinctures, followed by the 2 metals, white and yellow shields depicting the metals of silver and gold, and then at the bottom, furs, and these are the kind of conventional graphic depictions, representations of actual furs. Now you think of having a shield that you actually carry covered in fur seems like an extravagance and not particularly practical, but this was a conventional way of depicting wealth and status. And in fact, in many European countries, there were laws governing who could wear fur and how much fur you could wear, depending on your social status. The next way of thinking about heraldic design is through the geometric shapes. Again, one could spend a lot of time discussing the vocabulary for each of these and some of the ways in which they can be mistaken for one another, but it's just important to know they're there. The third slide in this group is, I've chosen just lions. This is the next slide. Just an array of lions represented in different poses. Lions are very common heraldic beasts, but many beasts can be depicted on coats of arms, as well as parts of beasts, paws or heads, and things as well, inanimate objects, weapons, tools, symbols of trades, household objects. There is a large visual vocabulary of images, which varies from country to country and from period to period. We can think of it as sort of a medieval clip art repertoire. And one thing I'll say before leaving this very brief introduction, here these things are, is that it's very often asked, what does a particular charge, a particular design element mean in a coat of arms? And unfortunately, there's no one easy way to answer that. Books on heraldry, of which there are many, usually avoid talking too much about that because there are conflicting systems of meaning, and there are conflicting opinions as to whether coats of arms always had the kind of meaning that they sometimes came to be invested with. Moving on to, collectively it's known as marshalling, ways of depicting more than one coat of arms on a shield. Here the example of quartering is for the Lords Baltimore, and this involves, through the English tradition, quartering arms inherited through one's mother, because coats of arms were usually inherited from father to son. But if your mother was an heiress, if she had no brothers to carry on the descent of that coat of arms in her family, her children would be entitled to quarter her arms, to depict them in a quarter, or in this case 2 quarters on opposite corners of the shield. And from this basic rule arose elaborate systems of quartering, not just 2 designs, but many. And there are some extraordinary cases of people doing depictions of well over 100 different coats of arms, and it can get very confusing. But quartering is an important thing to keep in mind when you're considering, from a genealogical perspective, who or what a coat of arms might tell you about a person's family. In the case of the Calvert's Lord Baltimore, the quartered arms are extremely well known because, as the next slide shows us, they are precisely what's used in the flag of the state of Maryland. This is the best of the 50 state flags that we currently have in this country, in that it represents pure heraldry, a quartered coat of arms inherited from a colonial governor, and also in that it looks like a very complicated and bold pattern, but again, if you know blazon, you're able to describe it precisely in very few words. The other important element of marshalling arms, I mentioned already, is impaling, displaying on half of a shield the husband's coats of arms on one half and the wife's coat of arms on another. And we'll come back to impaling. Again, like quartering, it helps us to identify a particular depiction of a coat of arms with a particular individual, but there are other issues there as well. The next slide is just one example of very elaborate impaling and quartering, and how it's sometimes difficult to tell what's going on. I'm going to place a red arrow on the left side of the shield, which we call heraldically the dexter, the husband's side of the shield, of this beautiful engraved bookplate for John Ross Delafield, an American genealogist from New York, the early 20th century. And he actually has 6 different coats of arms on his side of the shield. And it's a little bit hard to tell right from left because the helmet that overlaps the top of the shield is at an angle. And those are his 6 inherited coats of arms. And on the right side, his wife's quarterings. I'm going to click the arrow there. His wife's quarterings are shown as 4 designs within a design, but as you see, they're repeated. That's typical of quartering when you're just quartering 2 designs. And it's a very busy achievement, the whole achievement of arms on this bookplate. It has, in addition to the 8 to 10 coats of arms in the shield itself, there are a lot of other heraldic insignia on the outside of the design that represent interests and affiliations. My favorite when I studied this coat of arms is down at the bottom right. Oh, sorry, I'm obscuring it with my arrow. It's a little cluster of mushrooms, which stumped me until I learned independently that John Ross Delafield's wife was herself an accomplished mushroom expert, a mycologist. So coats of arms or the designs associated with them can have very specific personal meanings relevant to the lives of the people. The next set of aspects for how coats of arms can be modified or changed is what we call differencing, which is the slight variations in coats of arms as they are inherited among different members of the same family. Because the 2 competing principles are, 1, that a coat of arms can be inherited from father to sons, from parents to children, but 2, that coats of arms must always be unique. So in different countries, different systems of cadency or slight variations in coats of arms for the use of other members of the family, younger sons, not just the heir apparent, etc., came into being. We have in this design, we have the father here on the left and all the different symbols, which I think there were, at times there were people who thought that this should be the way things would be done, following a precise order of birth of younger children and applying these symbols to the coats of arms for them. But things never worked out perfectly in practice. The other varieties of differencing one finds include other kinds of alterations of a coat of arms to descend down in different branches of a family. And this is I've borrowed this chart depicting the bifurcations and alterations of the coat of arms of a Scottish Maxwell family, which include at this point you see the addition of looks like a symbol of Cadency in the middle of the cross. But down here you see the addition of a border around the central cross element. And then on the right, there's quartering with the blue bend, but also the addition where I've marked in red, the addition of a chief, another design at the top of the shield. And so there was no one system predicting how these, or prescribing how these differences should be applied to a shield of arms. And the next slide will remind us that there was always a potential for confusion with another common phenomenon, and that was the independent adoption or assignment of a coat of arms that was similar but slightly different to a family that might have the same name but might not be related at all to the original bearer of a coat of arms. In this case, the medieval family of Despenser bore the coat of arms depicted at left. And to the right, there were two Spencer families who, in different circumstances, began to use coats of arms that looked a lot like the Despenser coat of arms, but the names, in fact, have completely different derivation, and the families were unrelated. Now, origins. As a medievalist and as a historian, I could spend a lot of time talking about the origin of heraldry and its use in the Middle Ages, but I want to be pretty brief in this section. So the next slide just lays out a couple of salient points. Heraldry in Europe really is understood to have begun in the 12th century. The first identifiable inheritable coat of arms belongs to Geoffrey Plantagenet, the Count of Anjou, died in 1151. It was the father of King Henry II of England and the ancestor of all the British monarchs, essentially, ever since. I'm actually going to move to the next slide so you can see it. His tomb slab, a beautiful sort of full-size portrait in enamel in the Cathedral of Le Mans in France, depicts a shield with lions on it, and lions have been ever since the foundational visual element of the English royal arms, although they had different poses, there are different colors involved, and this is a significant element because it's through the fact that his descendants used the lion so consistently that we say with his tomb that this is essentially one of the first and a very high profile case of the first known proved events where the design was passed on from father to son and then to family members. So just other points about heraldry. It began as a system of putting a design, oh, sorry, I put that in there. I love this and I clicked on it because I like it. It began as a system to serve a very practical purpose, identifying soldiers in battle by putting these designs, these recognizable designs on their shields, but it very quickly spread to other non-military contexts. So we see the coats of arms on seals, and here they assumed an important element of associating them with your legal identity. A seal on a document was like a signature in modern times. And so the use of heraldry on a seal shows to us that it was really seen in this very specific legal context as an emblem of one's identity. So it spread to other media. It spread to seals. It spread to art. It spread to memorial art. Tombs of many different kinds abound with heraldry. It's in fact probably the largest repertory of heraldry that we have from the Middle Ages is in tombs of different kinds, tombs and monuments. This is Pedro Suárez, who was one of the brothers of Sancha de Ayala, who's a favorite ancestor of mine. She's a Spanish noblewoman who moved to England, is the ancestor of many American colonists. And so I've looked very carefully at her coats of arms. The castles on her brother's tomb here are the coat of arms that they inherited from their father. The coat of arms in the middle here is not a family coat of arms. It's a coat of arms of an institution, an order of knighthood founded by one of the Spanish kings to which this man belonged. So heraldry here, I'm giving you an inkling that it could serve other purposes as well as just identifying a family. In addition to spreading from shields to all sorts of other media, art, etc., heraldry also spread socially from knights to other members of society. And that's really the crux of our interest in heraldry as genealogists. One of the big questions is, well, who had coats of arms? Who was entitled to have coats of arms? And what does that tell us about the individuals and about the society? The section here we've titled Use and Regulation, because one of the best ways to understand heraldry is to understand how it was regulated, what people understood to be the limits and rules of heraldry, because that affects how we can make use of it as genealogists. So the first thing to cover is that, well, while heraldry started out as an ad hoc and user-defined concept in several European nations, it became something that was regulated at the national level. By the end of the Middle Ages, several European countries had some form of government body overseeing heraldry. Now, in the 21st century, some of those bodies still exist, and some countries regulate heraldry as a government, as the business of government. There are some countries that do it now that never did it before, and Canada and South Africa are examples of that. The Canadian Heraldic Authority was created in 1988, although, of course, like us, it had its roots in mother country, which also regulated heraldry. But the United States of America has no governmental regulation of heraldry at all. And that's something that I want to come back to in a couple of different ways. One thing I'll say while that slide is up, that we've just left, is that Americans can get coats of arms designed and registered in some of these other countries, especially Americans of English or Scottish descent. That's not something I'm going to spend a lot of time on right now, but we can come back to that in questions as well. So regulation of coats of arms evolved just the way the use of coats of arms did. By the end of the Middle Ages, a regulatory body in England was established. Heralds were crown officers who asserted royal control over who could or could not use coats of arms, and they claimed exclusive rights to grant coats of arms in the name of the king. While in the Middle Ages in England, anyone within reason could create a coat of arms and use it. By the end of the Middle Ages, this was something that was sought to be reserved exclusively to the English heralds. Now, why am I talking about England? I should have established this more. England was the mother country jurisdictionally of the United States, so its heraldic customs are important to us, even though we have never had any regulation of heraldry since our independence. So we will come back to that. The next slide raises the social question that I already touched on. Who could use a coat of arms? So who had coats of arms or who could have coats of arms? Originally knights, the ability to use coats of arms and interest in using coats of arms spread both up and down the social ladder. So while at first it was just soldiers on the battlefield, elite soldiers, but soldiers, very quickly kings and princes started using coats of arms as well, but also down the social ladder, merchants, artisans, and others began to adopt heraldic conventions and either to use coats of arms indistinguishable from their from nobles in their same society, or in some cases distinctive coats of arms, really showing that they belonged to an artisanal class. This is more common in Germany than in England. And just one other concept, the next slide, that I touched on already. Who else have coats of arms? In addition to individuals, and by the principle of heredity, families, corporate bodies acquired coats of arms and used them. We most commonly see this used by churches, schools, guilds, and similar corporate bodies, confraternities, orders of knighthood, other groups, and also the extension of coats of arms to come to represent kingdoms or provinces or jurisdictions, governmental jurisdictions, by transference from the fact that, well, once a king had a coat of arms, the kingdom had some right or some relevance to that coat of arms, although now, strictly speaking, the coats of arms of the sovereigns are separate from the coats of arms of the countries that still have monarchs. This was the process by which coats of arms, and perhaps more commonly now in the United States, we see coats of arms attached to things and not just to people. So we've already raised this question on the next slide. How does one get a coat of arms? At the beginning, you simply assumed the arms, and this vocabulary word is the assumption of arms, creating, designing by oneself without any granting authority. You didn't have to have permission from someone else to get a coat of arms. And it was at the end of the Middle Ages that in England, the crown officers asserted this as their sole prerogative. So assumed arms and granted arms are those two distinctions. So arms that are acquired by grant from an authority versus arms that you make up on your own. And both were originally perfectly acceptable, and the systems coexisted in England and in other places as well. The next concept, though, is the misappropriation of existing arms. And actually, this is back on the previous slide. And it's the problematic nature of using a coat of arms that already exists, but that was granted or assumed by somebody else. And this is something that we're coming back to with the questions of, well, how do we use heraldry as genealogists? The misappropriation of arms is the thing that we, in a sense, that we fear that we can be led astray by. Somebody using a coat of arms that actually belongs to a different family. And so if you think of the three ways to acquire a coat of arms: by assumption, creating it yourself; by grant, getting it from a recognized authority, with authority to grant the arms; or appropriating arms that belong to somebody else. We'll come back to the implications of those three systems in a moment. So heralds, who were the officials who developed in the retinue of armies and princes in the Middle Ages and then became crown officers, began in England to keep track of all users of coats of arms. And they began to assume a genealogical role, because one of the ways you keep track of who has a coat of arms is by keeping track of their families, and we'll see that in a moment. The next slide shows us an example of the acquisition of a coat of arms, and this is a gorgeous original document that's owned by NEHGS and can be seen in Boston on occasion when it's on display. It's a very early document of its kind. It's a patent, an official diploma recognizing that a coat of arms has been granted to a gentleman, Christopher Brown, by an official crown officer, a herald in England, and it's from 1480. And this is the original parchment representing this grant that was handed down in a Brown family until it came to it came to the NEHGS, I believe, in the early 20th century, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So in addition to the grant of arms by heralds, they also confirmed existing coats of arms under specific conditions. If the people whom they went out to visit county by county in this period from the 1530s to the 1680s, any gentleman who could prove that his coat of arms had been used for 3 generations had that coat of arms confirmed and recorded in the books maintained by the heralds, recording their visitations. Obviously, this was done for a fee. The heralds also enforced their exclusive right to control arms by punishing those who were found to use coats of arms without being entitled to. We'll come back to that as well. The next slide shows us an example, a page from one of these manuscripts that depicted the Heralds Visitations. And it's from an original manuscript in the British Library. Many of these visitation manuscripts have been published, and they are a marvelous source, the best source for who the heralds, the crown officers, thought were entitled to coats of arms in England in the century around the founding of the colonies in North America. They're not infallible. Many of them have been published, but not all of them have been. And they're a marvelous resource both for genealogy and for heraldry, and I'll mention again how those aspects intersect. So this gets us into the next section, which is the nature of the sources that show us who bore what coats of arms, and what these sources actually tell us about how we should approach them as genealogists. So heraldic reference works really consist of three types: rolls of arms, which are collections of coats of arms, drawn coats of arms belonging to a designated group of people. Ordinaries were more systematic manuscripts, usually, which linked arms. Actually, let's go to the next slide, which shows us an ordinary. It's a medieval manuscript which groups a lot of coats of arms by similar visual type. So you can use it as a visual reference aid to identify who's who when you see them in the wild. And these became larger and more systematic. In addition to just the painted image of a coat of arms, these began to be compiled textually. So using the language of blazon to systematically depict arms, you could have a textual reference work where you could look up specific designs, and that came a little later. The next type of reference work was just a larger compendium of coats of arms that was indexed or arranged not by the design, but by the type, by the name of the bearer of the arms. And so this is one of these manuscripts that was brought to Boston in the 1650s or early 1660s by a retired professional crown herald in England. And it was kept in Boston. It was used as a source by Boston herald painters to give coats of arms to colonists. Now, the implication of a big book of coats of arms where you can look up a name and find a coat of arms for that name is very important, because once you have reference books like this, then it becomes much easier to appropriate a coat of arms belonging to someone else. And the next slide shows us how this jumped from manuscript form into printed book form, because in the early decades or generations of printing, it was prohibitively expensive to print big books with visual depictions of coats of arms. But by the early 1700s, the 6th edition of this book, John Gwillim's Display of Heraldry, as the next slide shows us, had an every name index. And so this edition that came out in 1724 marks a watershed, after which point, because this was a much cheaper book to acquire than the older style of hand-drawn manuscripts, this represents a time after which people could simply look up a name in a book and find a coat of arms for that name, whether or not the person you're painting a coat of arms for had any genealogical relation to the original bearer of that arms. So the next slide shows us the fruit of that change. This is a famous manuscript in heraldic history in Boston. The Gore Roll of Arms started in the 1730s by herald painters here. The painters who kept that earlier English manuscript in their workshop, they could use it as a reference work. And so many of the coats of arms in the Gore Roll are authentic arms borne by the descendants of visitation families or grantees of arms from medieval England. But some of them are people who have just had coats of arms added to their names because the names are the same. We'll come back to that. So in this succession of reference works for heraldry, and I used the phrase a roll of arms at the beginning, as the earliest medieval type of depiction of a group of coats of arms together. The Committee on Heraldry of the New England Historic Genealogical Society, we've been doing this since 1864, and since 1916 we've been compiling a roll of arms of authentic coats of arms that are coats of arms of people in the colonies or in the United States for whom you can prove genealogically their right to those arms from the mother country, from an English visitation family or grantee, or from an armiger in another country. And the roll of arms has immigrants from 13 different European countries in it. We're going to move more quickly now to well, here, just a screenshot of the index to the roll of arms, and we may come back to more on that in the question period. But this is can be consulted online. You can see who's who included in the roll of arms. But the key concept that I wanted to get to perhaps a little earlier in this hour was defining the concept of authenticity, and I've come to that roundabout through this talk already. And those are coats of arms authentically borne by people whom you can genealogically prove were descended from the original bearers of the coat of arms. And this is to separate them from coats of arms borne by people or attributed to people simply because the name is the same. Now, the key aspects of that, moving forward, the next slide. So after the 17th century in England, the College of Arms had fewer powers of enforcement. The period of visitations came to an end. There was no tradition of legal enforcement of arms misused by people who weren't entitled to them. And so we're actually going to skip the next slide, which lays out the terms I already defined: the authentic arms proved by descent versus the assumed arms that are chosen by the bearer and don't infringe on existing arms of anyone else, versus the misappropriated arms, the names the same arms chosen because of the same surname but without any guarantee of genealogical descent. As a genealogist, how do you deal with a coat of arms you encounter in your research for an ancestor? And the decision tree really boils down to this: were the arms actually used by the ancestor you're looking at, or were they simply attributed to that ancestor in a modern genealogical work? And one shortcut is to look up and see whether that family is actually included in the roll of arms of the Committee on Heraldry. But if you have to do some of this deciding yourself, here is how to do it. So the next slide shows us the first and most basic example. If you are looking at material on an ancestor and you find a modern genealogy that gives you a coat of arms for him, like this is a gorgeous 1937 book, The Descendants of Hugh Brent, an early colonist in Virginia, and the frontispiece has this gorgeous coat of arms with a wyvern or some other similar beast. So what do you do with that? Well, in this case, we know, and the book tells us, that the immigrant, Hugh Brent, his parentage is unknown. So right away, you know that, well, he can't have any proved claim genealogically to a coat of arms by descent. This coat of arms did not belong equally to anyone with the name Brent. It is a specific coat of arms that belonged to a specific Brent family. And we can always assume, until you're proved otherwise, that there's more than one family with the same name. So this is a typical scenario. If you see it in a modern work, you need to be skeptical right off the bat. What if you see, like in this slide, the coat of arms in something that's really quite old? And in the 1700s, there were many renditions of an achievement of arms done for New Englanders or elsewhere. This one was made by a Boston herald painter in the end of the 18th century. And here it is a coat of arms that is clearly old, but it was not so old that it doesn't predate Gwillim's 1724 edition of the Display of Heraldry. And actually, if you look at the fine print, the little passage from that page of Gwillim, which has the same coat of arms, you see this telltale phrase, "He beareth such and such a blazon by the name of Ingram." And here I'll click on it here for you. So he beareth on a fess jewels, 3 escallop shells, or by the name of Ingram. Now you look down here at the motto. What should be a motto is actually by the name of Ingram, and that suggests to us that this was lifted out of this book specifically, as many of John Coles's heraldic paintings were, and this habit of, in the place of a real motto, using by the name of, is actually a telltale sign of having lifted a coat of arms directly from Gwillim's display of heraldry, where that phrase is used over and over again, without really understanding the meaning. And again, our first impression should be that we are skeptical that the person for whom this painting may have been made and sold to, they may not have any genealogical connection with the authentic bearer of the coat of arms that was mentioned in Gwillim's display of heraldry. But this brings us, the next slide, to a more specific to-do list of how we consider artifacts with coats of arms that come from, they're authenticated as belonging to the family in question and come from a very early date. And actually the 1724 cutoff is important. If the artifact is older than the 6th edition of Gwillim, then it may very well be something that we should have more confidence in. And I just want to come back to that with 2 more examples. The first is another gorgeous artifact on display in NEHGS in Boston, the Lemon Phillips filigree. It's a 3-dimensional quilled paper achievement of arms from 1735, so that's 11 years after Gwillim's display of heraldry, the 1724 edition. The initials of a woman, Mary Lemon, and 2 coats of arms. The coat on the left is used for a Lemon family in the 1724 edition of Gwillim's display of heraldry. The colors are a little bit faded out, but you can see here, I'm moving the red arrow, it's 3 leaping dolphins, 2 on the top and 2 on the bottom, above and below the sort of geometric shape known as a fess in the middle. Now, the other coat of arms, and this is an impaled coat of arms. The other coat of arms depicts Mary Lemon's mother, who was from a Phillips family, and we have a lion rampant here. Now, the left-hand coat of arms, the Lemon coat of arms, is in Gwillim's display of heraldry. This Phillips coat of arms is actually not. And I'm not actually sure whether it's identical to a Phillips coat of arms in the Promptuarium Armorum, the English manuscript that the Boston Herald painters had that was brought over in the 1650s or 60s. So this is in a gray area. You've got a compilation of 2 coats of arms, one of which is very possibly misappropriated. The other one is not yet fully identified. But now, it's a gray area genealogically, but of course, as an artifact, this is fantastic. It's glorious. And whenever we encounter these early heraldic artifacts, we should always carefully describe them and keep note of them, but we should not necessarily attribute the arms genealogically as belonging to the families with which they're connected without more research. The next one. The next slide is another type of very common early appearance of coats of arms in colonial documents and artifacts. So this is, it's a seal ring, it's a heraldic seal ring. Many early colonists in the 1600s used coats of arms on seal rings. And there were systematic efforts to catalog heraldic seals found in colonial archives that begun in the late 19th century. And actually, I think such projects should happen now, again, because it's much easier to compile this stuff with digital photographs of records. Now, one presumption is that since a seal ring is a legally authenticating mechanism, then one would be less likely to play around with misappropriating a coat of arms that didn't belong to you, or lying about it, sort of using a coat of arms to pretend to be someone you're not. Now, I choose this photograph because Mr. John Gifford, or Gifford here, gives us another way to think about this. And here's his signature next to the seal. So John Gifford, the coat of arms that he used was used by several actually independent Gifford families in late medieval England. So does John Gifford, whose origin is unknown, does he fit in these families? And no one knows. One other question to ask in his case particularly is, does character factor in when one considers whether a seal or a coat of arms might be, identity theft? Now, in his particular case, he was known to be a scoundrel. He lied to people. He was the manager, an early manager of the Saugus Iron Works. He ran the business into the ground. He made a lot of enemies. People didn't like him. And he may be one of my ancestors. That's why I like him so much. But the question is whether personal character goes into our calculation of whether a coat of arms is likely to be an authentic indicator of someone's ancestry or something picked up along the way. Unfortunately, in the case of John Gifford, it's not resolved one way or the other, but it is something to think about, and people like to argue about whether character should go into those. The next slide. And this is the very last example. And we saw this already, another impaled arms from the gore roll. And here it's even more clear. We've got one authentic coat on the left for the Saltonstall family, one of the only knightly families that came to New England in the early 17th century. And on the right, coat of arms for Mary Whittingham, who was Gurdon Saltonstall's wife. Now, the Whittingham family, Mary Whittingham's ancestors' origin in England is actually known. And her immigrant ancestor came from a Whittingham family in a different part of England than the family that used this coat of arms depicted here. So this coat of arms is from the Promptuarium manuscript that the Cole family who painted the gore roll had. So it may have just been looked up in that manuscript to add to this illustration. We can't take this as evidence that those two Whittingham families were actually related back in England, Mary Whittingham's family and the other one that we know had used this coat of arms by right, but they may have been. So I've ended this set of illustrations with gray areas, where it's very difficult to be sure. But the main point I wanted to bring you to was to be cautious, to be skeptical perhaps, but also to follow the leads that some coats of arms may give you. So really these are the conclusions. Coats of arms can be clues genealogically, but one has to be aware of the situations in which they're likely to be untrustworthy. When you find a coat of arms, it's very important to pay attention to how old it is. And because chronology may affect whether it's likely to be authentic or likely to be pulled from a same name reference. So we should carefully record the use of coats of arms in artifacts associated with our ancestors that they actually may have used, but we should be healthily skeptical and especially dismissive, really, of coats of arms that we find in modern compilations or uploaded to a public family tree on Ancestry. So I just want to leave you with it may be a bewildering variety of approaches, but the art is glorious. There are a lot of different ways to continue to learn about heraldry, and I'm eager to take your questions at this point. Oh,
and I should also mention that, thanks, Nat, for your presentation. I also want to mention that we do have a subject guide on this topic at AmericanAncestors.org. You can follow that link on your screen, and I will also be sharing that direct link with you in an email following today's broadcast. But let's move on to your questions. As you can tell, this is certainly a big topic, and we've only really just started to scratch the surface here. But in the time remaining, let's take a few questions. So, Nat, there are a few questions about changes in the surname between generations. You know, changes, spelling changes, sometimes, you know, more than just spelling changes. How are those, or are those ever reflected in the coat of arms?
That's an interesting question. And really, you have to think of the fact that a coat of arms is heritable property that does not really go precisely with the name. So the name could change. Certainly, the spelling of a name could change, but the general precept that a coat of arms is inheritable in the male line is important. Perhaps one motive for a question like that, though, is, well, what to do with how do you find a coat of arms of a surname that might be spelled different ways, and it might be available in some of these reference works with different coats of arms based on the different spellings of names. You simply cannot go on an equivalence of coats of arms going with a name, let alone with a certain spelling of a name. The important way to go about finding the correct coat of arms is the genealogical route. So in a way, the question of the spelling of a name becomes moot if you use that approach.
All right, and Teresa asks if you can kind of clarify under what circumstances a woman might inherit a coat of arms.
Yes, I'm sorry, that was on a slide that we then jumped past. In the English tradition, a woman can always inherit and use the coat of arms inherited from her father or her parents, but a woman can only pass a coat of arms to her children if the woman is herself a heraldic heiress, which means if she didn't have brothers or others who would pass on her parents' coat of arms to other members of her family, then the children that she had with her husband could add her coat of arms to their father's coat of arms. So in a way, it sort of coat of arms would follow the inheritance of a surname, but in that way, so if you think about it, if no one else could carry on the surname of your mother's father, if your mother's didn't have brothers, then you would be entitled to use her coat of arms as part of your own using quartering.
All right, and Herman asks, so in your research, how prevalent was it for early immigrants to America to really kind of continue to use, and I should say legitimately use, arms, coat of arms?
Right. Well, I think it's more prevalent than we realize. There's a very small number of surviving, for example, gravestones with coats of arms from all up and down the eastern seaboard, from the original English colonies. There was a project about 20 years ago to make a pretty definitive list of all the ones that survived from about the year 1750 on back, the earlier ones. But there's a much larger corpus of the use of coats of arms in things like seals and documents that are buried in archives. So for some people who we know they had the right to a coat of arms, we don't necessarily have any evidence that they used a coat of arms. For many other people for whom we have an artifact that shows they were using a coat of arms, we don't know whether they had an authentic genealogical descent that gave them the right to that coat of arms. So there are a lot of gray areas, but it's actually among the English colonists in the American colonies, it was perhaps more prevalent than we think.
And he was asking about illegitimate children within a family. Would they ever be kind of qualified to use a coat of arms?
Yeah, well, it's coat of arms is inherited property. So you think about it, though, generally speaking, legitimate children would inherit and illegitimate children would not. But in many situations, illegitimate children were themselves socially prominent, and their coat of arms could reflect an illegitimate connection to another family, their father's family, usually. Which also had a coat of arms. And that's one of the design elements, that there are heraldic symbols that are commonly associated with illegitimacy. So you'd add a certain symbol, like to difference your arms from those of your father's family, and certain symbols in some places at some times were used to indicate illegitimate descent. But you could have a coat of arms if you were illegitimate. It really kind of depended on your social situation as well.
Now, we have a few questions about German heraldry, and that's something that we really didn't have time to kind of delve into in this presentation. And I'm sure we could have any number of presentations just on German heraldry. But was there a regulatory, or is there a regulatory body for German heraldry?
So in the various German principalities, well, just they weren't centralized in many other ways, and so there was no evolved central kind of crown or national level office, either among United Germanies in the 19th century or within any of the larger German states. But there were kind of social expectations and traditions, and one of the German traditions is that noble families and other families with coats of arms would have those coats of arms compiled and published in essentially social registers of the nobility. So there are reference works to use for German arms of the different levels of the nobility, but it's not quite the same as the sort of regulatory tradition that we had in England and then we rejected in America.
And kind of the same question for France. Is there
France?
Go ahead.
Yeah, there's no regulatory agency, but there were at different times efforts to systematically compile information about all coats of arms within the kingdom, and or to essentially provide coats of arms to people for a fee. So there was in the late 17th century in France, there was a large initiative to compile a register of coats of arms and essentially to sell coats of arms to all sorts of people throughout France. It's an enormously interesting resource, but again, it's a slightly different animal in terms of the kind of political and governmental history that it represents.
And just a few more questions here. We had a few queries about, say someone has just kind of happened upon a coat of arms. They're not quite sure if it deals with their family history or what. So they're kind of starting with that image. How do you suggest that they kind of learn more about the coat of arms that they have, just based on kind of the artwork, more or less?
Well, there are some of the heraldic references, and I'm not sure exactly of the ones that are in the resource guide, which are the best ones to show you some of the characteristic style changes over time. So if you have a picture of a coat of arms that's completely got no information with it, you don't know where it comes from, and especially if it's published, if it's printed or published, you don't know sort of what vintage it is. I'm not sure exactly which reference book I would send you to suss it out stylistically for its age. But the most important precept is to be skeptical that it has anything to do with your family until you find out exactly where the image comes from, and then you have more to go on.
All right, and one final question. So Barbara asks, if you can't trace your genealogy completely to the original family, would DNA proof be acceptable now? I mean, have there been any circumstances or case studies that you're aware of that DNA was used to kind of prove that inheritance?
Well, specifically with heraldry, the issue is that you can prove especially a male line connection to a particular family, but you cannot necessarily know, and it depends on how close the Y-DNA match is. You can't know, if you don't already know the genealogy, you don't know how many generations back your male line kinship is. And so the problem is, if you are genealogically from the same male line as the bearers of a particular coat of arms, the question is whether the DNA proves that you were descended from a member of that family after they were granted the coat of arms, or whether you were simply descended from a distant cousin, might be the poor relations in the next parish, who never really would have been entitled to that coat of arms, because a coat of arms is only thought to belong to the descendants of the first documented bearer of that coat of arms, not to all their potential male line kin. The question can be answered a little differently in Scotland, though, because DNA of the Y chromosome can be used as a kind of proof of belonging in a clan or a sept, and the way that you may be entitled to, in the Scottish traditions, to consider the arms of a clan as somehow yours, or the badge of the clan as yours. That is an acceptable use, but that's not the same as proof that the coat of arms is yours by descent from the bearer.
All right. Well, thank you again, Nat. That was a fantastic presentation, but it does look like that's all the time that we do have for today. As Nat mentioned, you can find a subject guide on our website with links to a number of reference works and organizations, as well as a glossary of terms, and I will be sending that to you in my follow-up email. And if you'd like hands-on help with your research, you may want to consider scheduling a consultation with one of our experts, or even hiring our research services team. And if you're interested in learning more about those services, you can write to the email addresses on the current slide, but I will also include that information in my follow-up email to you. So thank you again for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. If you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org/education. I also encourage you to like us on Facebook and subscribe to our e-newsletter, The Weekly Genealogist. I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.